Hey everybody, it's Andy Kushner, host of The Wedding Biz. And I'd like to start by saying that this month is the 3-year anniversary of the launch of The Wedding Biz. And I have had such a blast bringing these stories to life of these iconic wedding and event professionals and helping to educate and inspire. But it also comes at a cost to me. And I've occasionally received comments asking how people can give back and support the show. And so it turns out there's a community-driven site where people can support creatives in delivering great content. And so starting for as little as $6 a month or 75 cents an episode, you can now lend me support to not only help you stay engaged with our industry's thought leaders, but also to expand on the kinds of content that The Wedding Biz delivers. So please go to theweddingbiz.com, where you'll find a link to become a patron and support the show. There's also links in the show notes, again, where you can become a patron and support the show, and I thank you very much for doing that. So I want to say that if you missed last week's episode, it was very, very dynamic, and it was with Steve Kemble, who is an extremely experienced and successful planner and designer, very charismatic, incredible with self-promotion. I really highly recommend you listen. You'll learn quite a bit listening to Steve talk. So this week's guest is Bill Baker, whom I interviewed in February. Behind every leader, behind every brand, behind every strategy, idea, or initiative, there's a story. And Bill makes these stories strategic and come to life. His definition of storytelling is that they're an exchange of meaning shared between people, a way for people to share ideas, experiences, emotions, thoughts, and meaning from one person to another, and for a purpose. So it's about storytelling with objectives and goals to have impact, with influence and a desired goal in mind. And when someone shares a story with you, it engages your brain in more ways, and you become more of a sponge to soak in the messages. And so Bill talks in detail about how to do this, as well as the importance of making sure that our teams and our creative partners also understand the story of our brand and mission. And he also gives tips for working stories into presentations. This is a very, very valuable episode. You might even want to listen to it 2 or 3 times. So enjoy my conversation with Bill Baker. Bill, I know that you help anyone in business understand how to use stories to influence their business. And I would first, though, love to get a little bit into your background in terms of, what led to what you're doing today. And I know that your company, BB and Company, you founded it in 2010. Though before that, you went to college in Maine. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Northeast Ohio, actually, at a prep school in a town called Hudson, and the prep school was called Western Reserve Academy, and my dad was a teacher there. So I lived on this beautiful campus from when I was 5 to when I graduated when I was 18. So it was like an idyllic spot for kids to grow up. And then I ended up going to college up in Maine at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine.
Yeah, and you also studied in Europe, didn't you?
Yeah, I like a lot of kids. I spent my junior year abroad. So I studied in Freiburg, Germany and Paris, France, a semester each in both of those places. So I was a double major in French and German. And so it was a natural place for me to go.
Did you have any thoughts at the time in college of what you would do with that major moving forward?
Well, no, I mean, as a liberal arts major, I knew very little about a lot of different things. So liberal arts majors were very good at Trivial Pursuit and Jeopardy.
Right.
But it's very much about getting a well-rounded education. But my senior year, I started looking into the advertising business because a bunch of people had recommended that to me and thought it might be a good fit.
But why do you think that is? Why do you think people thought that for you, that would be your place to go?
Well, I've always been kind of a creative person, and I've always enjoyed the creative arts. I did a lot of theater when I was in high school and college. And the more I talked to people, they recommended that I look into marketing or advertising, and they just thought it might be a good fit with my personality as well as perhaps leveraging my creativity.
So what did you do with that idea? I mean, it's one thing to get advice like that, but then to actually manifest it is a whole nother story. What did you do next?
Well, I bought a suit and I went down to New York City and I literally just pounded the pavement. Bowdoin College, fortunately, had a very good alumni network. So I used that network to do informational interviews and talked to a lot of different people. And then I was very fortunate enough to get a great entry-level job at an agency called Gray Advertising, working on Procter & Gamble business.
It's funny, Bill, when you say you bought a suit. I graduated from Boston University. I bought a suit. Yeah, I didn't own a suit. I bought like one suit, a briefcase, put together a resume, and I did the exact same thing. I was having trouble getting job interviews, and so I one day walked past the Career Counseling Center of Boston University, and I found this book of alumni, and I was interested in the computer business at the time, and I found an alumni from IBM, and that's what led to getting the job. So, you're really creative and resourceful doing that as well.
You have to be. And I did the same thing at the time, and I was just lucky enough that one of my informational interviews at Gray, she liked me, and she said, you know what, I'm going to pass your resume on to the HR department. And it kind of unfolded from there.
So what were your responsibilities?
Well, so I worked in client service or account management. And so I was an account guy. So I worked with the clients. And when I was at Gray working on the Crisco shortening account, if you remember that.
I remember Crisco, all the TV commercials. Oh,
exactly. I learned how to bake pies really, really well.
Right.
And then, I stayed in New York City for 10 years, working at Gray, then working at an agency called Lowe & Partners. And then my last 4 years there, I was at Saatchi & Saatchi, running the Tide business for Procter & Gamble, basically around the world. But at that time, this was in the mid to late 90s. In the advertising business, account planning or brand planning or strategic planning started to become a thing. And so more and more, I started becoming very interested in that, not just managing clients and servicing clients, but also helping those clients figure out their strategic direction, what their brand was all about, and really figuring out the essence of the products and the brands that we were helping them sell.
So where did you go from there? Because I know it was still another 10 years before you started your company. What did you do next?
Well, then, I fell in love and with a guy from Vancouver, and I ended up moving in 1998 from New York City to Vancouver. You could not think of a more different place to move to. Certainly.
I was going to say, I love Vancouver, but that's really different.
Yeah. So I after 10 years in New York City, I loved New York City. Like, it was a great place for me to grow up as an adult. I was so poor when I started working there. I knew every bar that served food at happy hour. I used to steal sandwiches from the office all the time, from lunch meetings, and lived on those. But after 10 years in New York, I was kind of done with New York. And so I always thought that I would live on the West Coast. And then I met my partner, and it's a long distance relationship that blossomed into something bigger. And 22 years later, we're still together.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so it was a great move for me. And Vancouver's a wonderful city to live in. I say that I moved here because I fell in love with a Canadian, but then I kind of fell in love with Vancouver. And then Canada. So I'm a dual citizen now, and I go back and forth between the U.S. and Canada all the time.
So what was it that led to, this moment? I imagine there was some kind of moment, some epiphany, or wanting two things. First of all, to start your own company, being an entrepreneur, but also a company that specializes in storytelling and teaching people how to use it as a tool for their business. I mean, what was the transition point there?
Well, so when I moved to Vancouver, I worked for a big multinational agency called DDB, and I managed the Vancouver office. So I was responsible for about 150 to 200 people at any one time, as well as the financial performance of that office. I was also part of the global strategic planning group for DDB. So a small cadre of people who were developing the strategic planning tools that DDB used around the world. And so, if I was going to stay in the advertising business, it was a great company to work for. But after 8 years, I was really getting tired with the advertising business. It's very creative. It's very stimulating. You work with amazing people, but it is a bit soul-sucking. And so I was looking for, what's my next move? And I got recruited by a storytelling company that happened to be in Vancouver that I had never heard of. And I think in part because they were based in Vancouver, but they worked with organizations and clients all over the world. So they were a Vancouver-based company, but they didn't really do a lot of business in Vancouver. And, again, as luck would have it, I just stumbled across these people, or they stumbled across me and recruited me to come in and be a partner. And so I worked at this company that's no longer around, but it was called Envisioning and Storytelling. And it really was all about mirroring the logic of strategic planning and brand planning with the magic of storytelling. And for me, as someone who grew up doing that brand planning and that strategic planning, as well as just being a storyteller all my life, it was like a match made in heaven.
Before we continue with your story, it would help me to understand how you define storytelling. I know this is what's going to, we're going to get into for this entire conversation, but just to help, for me to follow the story, how do you define storytelling in this context?
I define storytelling as an exchange of meaning shared between people. And so it's a way for people to share ideas, experiences, emotions, thoughts, meaning from one person to another. And I would add to that for a purpose, because as we'll talk further about what I do and how we use storytelling, in our world, it's always storytelling with objectives, with goals in mind. This is why I'm sharing this story with you at this time, because I need you to think, feel, and do this. So in our world, mirroring storytelling with business or storytelling with organizations, brands, and companies, it's storytelling with impact, with influence, and a desired goal in mind.
Wow. So, but it seems, just a layman at this, I would imagine that starting a business about storytelling is something that's outside of most people's mindsets. To grab their attention, get them to understand what you offer, and that you need to build a business and earn income with this seems challenging to me.
Well, fortunately for me, I started a business in storytelling when storytelling was starting to become, very much in fashion in the business world. And even though I've been doing it for now about 14, 15 years, I started my company 10 years ago, but I've been doing it about 4 years before that. It was really, I started my business just at the right time when storytelling was becoming very, very popular and quite the buzzword. As I'm sure a lot of your listeners can appreciate, it was very much a leap of faith when I stepped off the dock and decided to hang my own shingle out. But fortunately for me, it was the right thing to do at the right time.
Well, and I'm thinking for us in the event business, in the event industry, right now, the word storytelling has already become huge. This is something, matter of fact, one of the really major planner designers I interviewed on the show, and there's many who talk about this, but in particular, Brian Raffanelli, who specifically said, what I do is tell stories. I am a storyteller.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people do that, especially in great events. When you go to an amazing event, whether it's a wedding or a corporate event or something of that nature, when it's really done well, you as a participant in it, as a guest in it, have an impression. There is something that is developed and starts to wash over you as you go through that event. And you start to notice kind of a consistent theme all the way through, and a feeling that you're having, and more importantly, an experience that you're sharing with other people. And I would say probably 99.9% of the time, that does not happen by chance. That happens because some amazing event planner has actually orchestrated that and choreographed that. They have made sure that this is the feeling I want you to have all the way through. This is the idea that I want you to get from this event. And actually, this is the story I want you telling about this event once that event is over.
There's a quote I found, I don't know if it was an interview or on your website. You said, we've found that articulating a company's brand, vision, values, mission, etc., in a more storied way than using storytelling to bring those things to life is more effective at connecting the essence of a company's brand to the people responsible for its realization. I love that. Can you say more about that?
Well, there's lots of scientific evidence that shows that we as thinking sentient human beings, we remember stories. And without getting into too much detail on it, the reason we do is because when someone shares a story with you, it uses and engages more in different parts of your brain. It literally makes your brain more active, more open, and more like a sponge to absorb stuff and remember stuff. And that's why we remember stories when we forget facts and pieces of information. And what a lot of companies do, and we help companies do this as well, large and small of all shapes and sizes, a lot of companies want to figure out is, what's my vision statement? What's my mission statement? What are my organizational values? And those tend to be the triad of a typical strategic foundation for any organization or any brand. The problem is that people sweat over, what's this sentence? What are these words? And then they figure it out and they throw it up on a wall somewhere in a lobby or on the back page of an annual report. And they never really think about how to connect those ideas to the people who are responsible for bringing those ideas to life each and every day in their jobs. And so what we do is we help our clients present those ideas in a more storied way, but more importantly and more specifically, tell stories that bring those ideas to life. So for instance, organizations typically have organizational values. And let's say we have 5 different values. And one of them is about helping people realize their true potential. So that's their value statement. But what they often do is say, that's our value, that's it. And they just leave it at that and hope that someone really resonates with that. What we do is say, no, share that value, but then take another 2 or 3 minutes and actually tell a story of that value coming to life. And when people do that, when they share a story, we talk a lot of times about helping people realize their full potential. But let me tell you a story about when we did that for one of our employees or one of our customers or one of our guests. A story takes that message, takes that idea, and makes it real for people so that the person hearing that story goes, now I totally get what you're talking about now. It makes it real for them.
What's coming to mind for me is that, again, in this event industry, we are, all of us, planners, designers, photographers, we're all telling a story, about our clients. Mm-hmm. And also obviously being aware of their vision and relating it, and, especially in terms of what their personality is and letting the guests understand this. But I don't know that we are as nearly effective at telling our own story for prospective clients to bring in business.
Amen. I've done a lot of work with entrepreneurs specifically and with EO, Entrepreneurs Organization. And one of the things I work with them on is, for instance, every entrepreneur should have a story about why he or she started the business to begin with. Everyone should have a story about the impact they're trying to create for the people they work with, about the experiences they're trying to orchestrate or choreograph. And part of thinking strategically about storytelling and the way you're using storytelling is thinking about, well, what are the messages that I want to get across to my potential clients, for instance? And then maybe I can develop or just think about identifying over time stories that will help bring those things to life.
To help illustrate this, how about if we put this on you, and then maybe we'll come up with a situation or a type of a job in the event industry that you can help me with to illustrate. But why are you doing this? What is your story?
Well, for me, I kind of stumbled across it. So as I told you before, I got recruited by this storytelling company, but that company was really involved with helping a lot of high-end developers and resort developers develop the story around the places that they were building and then eventually selling to people for millions and millions of dollars. I was brought in to help them do that same sort of discipline with more corporate clients. And when I started doing that, one of the things that I would do is I would often speak at conferences. And this is how I stumbled into storytelling training specifically. So I was speaking at a conference in Chicago, and someone from GE happened to have been in the audience. And that person called me up about 3 months later and said, I saw you speak in Chicago, and you did a great job in your talk, and we all really enjoyed it. And I said, no, thank you very much. And she said, but I noticed that you told a lot of stories in your speech, and they were really good stories. They were engaging, but they also made a point and really helped me think about something differently. And I said, oh, well, that's really nice to hear. And she said, we're wondering if you've ever taught anyone how to do that. And I said, no. And she said, do you think you could? And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? Because she said, this has happened to be at GE at the time. And she said, at GE, we're trying to turn our leaders into better storytellers. And that's a discipline that has been identified that we need to develop. And we're looking for people to help us do that. So they brought me in and I developed a curriculum and started teaching GE executives. And I still work with GE all the time. But now we've developed a curriculum to teach managers, directors, entrepreneurs, all sorts of people about how to use storytelling in their communications to persuade, influence, and inspire people. And it's kind of grown from there. And it's now part of the leadership development curriculum for companies like GE, Coca-Cola, Dell, Prudential, Cisco, and so on.
See, now right there, you were telling the story about her conversation with you, and I really was engaged. Right away, that got me engaged. And I understand now what you're saying about, when you started to tell, especially that part of the story, I was right there with you. And it took away the real formal, official, aspect of this. And I was able to relate much better hearing that. I could imagine myself being in that room and hearing that, or even being her saying that to you.
Well, and again, thinking about your listeners and the business they're in and meeting with a potential client. Obviously any potential client may have stumbled across your listeners, know their work, attended one of their events. But when they're sitting down for that initial meeting with that person to actually explore the possibility of that event planner doing an event for them, they want to get to know that event planner. They want to know not just their work, which they can probably see on their website, the photos, the testimonials, all that sort of stuff. But if I'm going to entrust you with my wedding, I want to know not just what you've done in the past. I want to know about how you think, what you're trying to achieve, what you're going to do for me. And don't get me wrong. I think any event planner meeting with a potential client probably has a list of facts and information that they want to sell, to share with them. This is our approach. This is our process. This is how we work with you. This is what you're going to get. This is how much it costs. But they should infuse that with different stories to help bring some of those things to life. And as you just mentioned earlier, connect with people in a more visceral, more human way.
So can you help give some tools? I mean, first of all, I'm assuming, obviously, we can learn to be better storytellers.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times people, and I run into this all the time, Andy, with in the workshops that we do, people will come up to me at the start of a workshop and they'll say, "Can I talk to you for a second?" And they pull me into the corner and they're like, "I'm an awful storyteller.
Right.
Bad storyteller. I would never do this at work." And I'm like, you know what? You're probably better than you think you are, because we've all been hearing stories and telling stories all of our lives. But don't worry, I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to break it down into some core fundamentals and some mechanics to teach you how to do this. And the analogy I often use is I play the piano, and I've played the piano all my life. I will say to a room full of people, I could teach everyone in this room how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the piano. I could teach you the mechanics of how to do that, and everyone would be able to do it. Now, some people might have some more natural proclivity for it than others, but I can teach everyone how to do it. And it's the same thing with a story. If you know the building blocks of how to put a good story together, the arc of it from start to finish, but also how to think about it strategically so you understand the impact that you want that story to have, to me, that's about 80% of it. And if you're a great storyteller, fine. But just because you're not the most theatrical, animated, descriptive storyteller doesn't mean you shouldn't still tell a story in your communications.
Well, and you just did it a moment ago with me. I mean, when you were talking about core fundamentals and mechanics, I was thinking, well, what does that mean? And then you started to tell the story about if I were teaching on piano, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and you went on with that, then I got it right there.
So there's a little analogy to help you understand the meaning of what I'm trying to say. So taking an idea and bringing it to life, in that case, with a little analogy for 15, 20 seconds that helps you, oh, that's what you're talking about.
So can you tell us more about, what are some of the core fundamentals and mechanics that we could use in our business here in the event industry with let's say, prospective clients to begin with?
There's two ways to think about it. And this is kind of the two parts of our business. So let me just take a step back first and tell you about what we do. In one sense, about 50% of our work is we go in and we help organizations and companies uncover the story of their brand Or in some larger companies, it might be a branded initiative, a new effort or division that they're creating. And we help them uncover that and articulate that in a more storied way. And then we use a lot of storytelling techniques to engage and align their workforce around that story so they understand how to bring that story to life day to day in their prospective work. Those are larger consulting gigs that we do over the course of several months. The other half of the business, as I said earlier, is we go in and we do workshops training people how to be better storytellers and how to use storytelling in their communications. So in that regard, in terms of the mechanics of effective storytelling, we approach it three ways, through three different steps. First and foremost is before you think about the story, you have to think about the strategy. Another way to say that is before I think about what story I'm telling, I need to identify why I'm telling it and the impact I want it to have. And so what we work with people on is getting them to identify, what do I need a story to do in terms of the impact I want it to have on my audience, so I can find the best story to meet those requirements. And so you think strategically about, like, literally, what do I want the audience to do? What do I want this person to do? I want this person to sign up with my business and have us do their event. What do I think they need to think and feel in order to do that? And sometimes those are new thoughts and feelings I want them to have, or it might be a mental or emotional barrier that I need them to get over. So for instance, a mental barrier could be, I'm really intrigued by the events that you do, but I know you're one of the most expensive event planners around. That could be a mental barrier that event planner needs to lower in order to get them to do what they want them to do. And then I think about messages that I want them to take away, or messages and ideas I want them to have. So maybe the messages, I want them to think that, you get what you pay for. Or sometimes it's worth splurging on important moments in our life. And when you do, you won't regret it. So that might be a message that I want to convey. And then I find a story that's going to bring that message to life, to shape those intended thoughts and feelings, to motivate the action I want them to have.
But is this generally taking a personal story from your life that illustrates it, or creating a story, almost like you did with the piano example?
It can be both, but I would say most often when I think about your audience, it would probably be pulling a story from their own experience. And probably it could be a story about, let me tell you a story about a client we worked with 2 years ago who was thinking exactly what you're thinking and kept humming and hawing like, oh, I don't know. This is so expensive. This is way much more money than we were planning on spending. We didn't budget for this. And they tell a story about how that person then eventually got to the event, had the event, and came up to me afterwards and said, you know what? I would spend every penny all over again if I had the chance to do it again. It was all worth it. So that's about finding a story to bring that idea to life and help the attended audience understand better.
Well, see, I like what you're saying, because I think that a lot of us might instead want to, like you talked about, the money issue. So we might want to just address that in some way that is really, to the client, it's a bunch of words. It's to actually connect it with, like you just said, an example of, let's say I'm a planner, an example of another client that I dealt with who has a similar, let's call it, objection or concern that this person in front of me is saying, to then illustrate it. I used to be very heavily involved in songwriting, and we would talk about, with lyrics, you want to show it rather than say it.
I love that.
Creating imagery.
And I often say, when we're working on stories, I'm like, don't just tell me, show me. And a story shows me, whereas a message or facts and information tell me. And I want to be very clear. It's not that a story always replaces that facts and information. A story builds upon it and helps make it more real for people.
So, again, you said earlier, people come up to you and say, oh, I'm a terrible storyteller. What can I do? Can you give a little more guidance to us? Again, whatever we do in the event industry, I happen to be doing entertainment. And as a matter of fact, I just did an event, destination wedding in Florida, where, I very much was able to apply the principles of telling a story for this client. It wasn't just a band that just showed up for a reception, but it was taking the entire weekend, finding out their vision and who they are. And they were such sweet people, and they really wanted people to bond with each other. Everyone was flying in from out of town to this one location. And, they were talking about how, right in the beginning, they wanted some way of people who don't know each other to be able to meet each other, and something that would happen in the very beginning of that weekend that would help everyone feel more at home, feel more connected with each other, so that by the time they got to the next day with the ceremony and the reception itself, that there was already this group kind of feeling, group vibe. And we did something in the very beginning with music, and we got everyone all together. And but to be able to again, illustrate this ahead of time with someone rather than just giving the solution, but to say something, to tell a story that, from what I'm getting from what you're saying, first of all, lets this potential client know, how much we care, how much we understand, what it is that they need, what it is they want, what it is that they desire. And again, to illustrate it, to show it rather than say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That seems to be the challenge here.
Well, I think that, we were talking earlier about how an event planner can use storytelling in the courtship process to maybe get some clients over some mental and emotional hurdles they're having before they sign up with that event planner. So that's part of kind of the sales or business development process. What you're talking about, Andy, I could see very much an event planner when the event planner starts working with the client, really understands what they're hoping for, the feeling, the experience, all that sort of stuff. And then that event planner says, okay, I'm going to go think about this for a while with my team, and we're going to come back and present something to you. I think one of the best ways they can do that is to say, before I jump into the details and show you the color palettes and all that sort of stuff, let me tell you the story of how I'm envisioning this event unfolding. And if it's over the weekend, it's the story from literally when people arrive, or actually even before they arrive. The story may start with when they get the invitation, or even the save the date.
That's
and
right.
They're telling the story of that person's experience from start to finish, and doing it in a descriptive way. And maybe they say, I'm going to tell you the story of two of your guests, a young couple who one of you knows, but they don't really know anyone else who's coming to your wedding. They're a little nervous about it. They know it's going to be kind of fancy. They're going to have to buy new clothes for it. But the story about their transformation over the course of the weekend, and how you're putting them together with other people, and they're getting to know people, and literally of the story about not just what happens, but the story of what happens to them over the course of that weekend, or the course of that evening, or whatever the case may be. I think that would be a very powerful way for your event planners to bring the experience that they envision to life before we start looking at the schematics and the table planning and the settings and all that sort of stuff.
I like that. Well, and also just emotionally speaking, now it connects us, whether we're a photographer, a floral designer, a cake designer, whatever we do. It makes us human, right? And connects us with this potential client. And now they can hear the facts, figures, all of that much in a more trusting way.
Absolutely. Because what you've done with that story is you have paved the way for them to be more receptive to those facts. And
there we go.
And
that's it.
And here's the other thing, let's say one of the things that you're recommending, like, this is why you're going to need to spend this much money on the band versus this much money on a DJ. If I tell the story effectively, it might make that financial pill much easier to swallow. One of the things that I talk often about in the storytelling training that we do is there's a difference between just reporting information and telling a story. And one of the ways to think about it in the scenario that you and I are talking about is a report is often about what has happened or what is going to happen. So an event planner would report to the client, okay, so at 6:00, we're going to serve champagne. At 7:00, people are going to be seated for dinner. At 8:00, the band's going to start. That's a report of information. But a way to think about a story is a report is about what is going to happen. A story is about what's going to happen to people. And that's when they start to get into what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're doing, what they're feeling, and what they're experiencing.
It's interesting in the event industry, it's all about emotion. I mean, that's what we do, and a lot of people I interview call it, we're in the business of happy, it's all emotions. And so to be able to communicate with people in a more effective emotional way. What about those of us who have companies, who have people working for us? whether they're in sales, marketing, PR, designers, whatever the case may be. What about getting them, again, to understand what the story of the business is? How do we communicate to our own employees or even a potential person we're interviewing so that we really know if it's the right fit? How do we communicate to our own people working for us about this?
I just want to jump on the emotion thing that you mentioned before,
sure.
Because your business is clearly all about emotions, and emotions are what ultimately linger with people and what they remember and tell stories about. And there's a quote that I often use that I love from Maya Angelou, where she says, "People may not remember what you said, they may not even remember what you did, but they will always remember how you made them feel."
Right. I love that.
And I think there's nowhere more important, where that's more important than in great events. In terms of what you were asking about, though, how do I make sure if I've got an extended team, if I'm running an event planning company, and let's say I've got 10 people that are working with me or 20, how do I make sure they're all completely bought in? Part of that is making sure that those teams, those organizations are taking the time to step away from their business for a second and think about their business and their brand and the fundamental pillars of what they're all about. Their perspective on the business they work in, their mission and sense of purpose for what they're ultimately trying to do for their clients, the values, the ideals or beliefs that shape the way they work. A lot of times organizations don't take the time to step away and either individually or collectively with their teams think about that sort of stuff. And that's the kind of work that's that other side of the business that we do, where we help companies go about doing that. So you have to define those pillars of your brand and of your business. And then you need to make sure that everyone working with you, not just that's on your team and that you pay, but your partners, your suppliers, all that they are fully understanding that essence of who you are and why you exist and the higher purpose driving your work. And you have to make sure they fully understand that and embrace it. And one of the best ways to do that, as I said earlier, is to bring those ideas to life through stories.
Mm. And what about for presentations? Many of us, like, for example, I've got 3 coming up. I'm presenting for various event organizations. And I've thought a great deal, especially coming from entertainment as well, how can I give a presentation in the most effective way to really engage people and, versus just an in-person conversation? How do we use storytelling in our presentations?
Well, again, storytelling, think about like using stories, either like full narrative stories with a plot and a start and a finish, or little pieces of storytelling like analogies or metaphors peppered throughout the presentation. But when I'm doing a presentation, let's say a keynote address at a conference, 99.9% of the time, I will start with a story. But the story that I'm starting with has been very carefully selected and developed because I'm using that story to shape the way I want my audience to think and feel about the stuff that I'm here to talk about. If I've been asked to, Bill, can you come and talk to this group about the fundamentals of effective storytelling? At some point in that presentation, I have to report and share the fundamentals of effective storytelling. That's basically information, ideas, and process. But I will almost always start with the story to shape the way I want that audience to think and feel about those fundamentals before I dive into them. So a lot of times thinking, Andy, a great way to think about it is, what is the story that I can use at the start of this talk to really pave the way and set the stage for the stuff that I'm here to talk about? Then also think about peppering little pieces of storytelling throughout your presentation to take an idea and bring it to life. Let me tell you a quick anecdote to illustrate this point that I just made, for instance.
Sure.
And then maybe, I would say for me, I always like to close a presentation with one last little inspiring piece of storytelling. And that may be a short story, but it could also be, a great video clip or a beautiful quote from someone. Those are also ways for you to share meaning with other people and put an idea out into a room.
So tell me, is there anything else before, we get to wrapping up that you would like to share with us with this particular audience?
I think that, based on the conversation that we were just having and some of the ideas you've sparked in my own head is, when I think about events, and the impact that those events have on the people participating in them, and frankly, the people paying for them. I think when people recall those events and talk about it with other people, oh, you went to a wedding this weekend, how was it? We naturally do that through stories. And I think that one of the best ways the event planners can leverage that power is to think about in advance, what are the stories that I want people telling about this event? And as we talked about earlier, sharing those potential stories, envisioning what that story should be with the clients, getting them bought in, and then making sure that they are orchestrating that event to bring that story to life and make that story happen. It is a natural fit with this area because when people recount those experiences, we do so through stories.
You know, it's so interesting. You just struck a chord here. When I first meet with a client, I will say to them, I mean, this is someone who's already hired me, and now I'm getting to get together with them to talk about how I'm going to custom curate this music and entertainment for their event. I will often start early by saying, what is the emotion that you would like your guests to feel? However, Bill, you're changing this, you're giving me a different take on it. That's one thing. You know, I want to know the emotion. But rather to say how you just said it to them, what is the story that you would like your guests to be talking about after this is over of the experience? I feel like I am going to get, again, whether I'm an entertainer, photographer, planner, designer, whatever I am, I'm going to get way more information asking it that way.
Yeah, well, one way, that might be a little challenging to put that on a potential client or actually a client that signed up. I think to ask a client, like, what do you want people feeling? What do you want them saying about this event? And so when you ask them about what do you want them saying, those are kind of, oh, it was amazing.
That's a little more easy. Yeah.
It's a little easier. Like, I met people I've never met before. I danced longer than I've ever danced in my life. Things like that. So those are messages. And then I would suggest that the event planner takes that all away. And then the event planner comes back and says, based on what you've told me, let me tell you the story of how this event is going to unfold. And then before we dive into the details, I think that's probably an easier thing for clients to engage in and an event planner to build upon to come back with this hypothetical story of how the event is going to transpire.
I love that. So can you tell me about your workshops that you offer?
Yeah, so it's called Leadership Through Storytelling. And, unfortunately, we most often do them for individual companies. So we will go in and a company will pull together a group of people or leaders who they feel would need that training. Every once in a while, we just did one of these at the end of January. In my hometown of Vancouver, we will do an open enrollment one or a conference for whatever industry will ask us to come in and do a workshop as one of the breakaway groups that they offer to their participants. But it's basically usually a full day workshop, sometimes a half day workshop. But in that workshop, I'm teaching people the fundamentals of effective storytelling. You and I talked earlier about like thinking strategically about the stories. That's step one. Step two, though, is actually developing the content of that story and the plot structure of it and making sure that it's tight and focused, but also achieving the strategy that you need it to achieve. And then we also work on delivery, giving people some tips and ideas on how to just be a better, more engaging, compelling storyteller that people actually want to listen to from beginning to end.
Well, thanks so much, Bill, because I think, again, for us to understand better what this means, to weave stories, to be storytellers in the context of what we do is something that, it's been like a buzzword, but you've really helped to illustrate what it really means and how we can effectively use it. So thank you.
Yeah. And the thing I often say to people is you kind of know how to do this already. I just want you to do it better. It's like I always say to people, you know how to ride a bike. I just want you to ride a bike better with more purpose and more focus. And Andy, I know this information will be available, but I encourage people, if they want to find out more, to go to my blog. There's lots of deeper insight, but more importantly, some concrete instruction on how to apply this.
And how do we get to your blog?
It's BBCO Storytelling, so bbcostorytelling.com, and then /blog.
Got it. Well, great, Bill. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Bill Baker. Was that an amazing amount of information? So useful for all of us. Be sure to check out his website, which is bbcostorytelling.com. Again, bbcostorytelling.com. where you can get all kinds of information, including his workshops. His social media handles on LinkedIn is Storyteller Bill Baker, and on Twitter and YouTube, it is at Storyteller Bill. And you can find all of this in the show notes or at our website of theweddingbiz.com. And don't forget to check out the follow-on segment coming out each Wednesday after each interview of the week called The Next Level, in which I have a guest co-host and we talk about some of the highlights and in a way that you could use to raise your own business to the next level. And this week's guest co-host is going to be Sean Lowe of the Business of Being Creative. And I want to thank today's sponsor, which is the Music Makers Podcast. Again, the Music Makers Podcast, where you can get behind-the-scenes stories from the most influential music industry pros around, including artists, record producers, songwriters, recording engineers, managers, record industry executives, and more. So we'll catch you next week on The Wedding Biz.